So Lee, we are going live.
Very good.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome from ISER Kolkata. Thank you for joining us today for this talk, which was supposed to be held on Darwin Day on 12th of February, but we had to postpone it because of some unavoidable reasons. And we are extremely excited to have with us today none other than Professor Alan Dugatkin, who has very graciously accepted our invitation and woken up early in the morning to deliver us this talk today. It's a great pleasure. So before we start, let me formally introduce Dugatkin to you. Many of you who are students of animal behavior would probably have already heard about him, read many of his books. My personal introduction to Dugatkin began when I was a PhD student early in my PhD days with this book. And this book has been quite an inspiration, and I highly recommend it to my students today and my children today. So this was the first time I read a book by Lee, and I became a fan. And after that, I have not given up an opportunity to grab one of his books whenever I see them. And it was such a fantastic surprise when Lee wrote a book on dog domestication. And that has, been kind of selling like hotcake, being translated into multiple languages, and he's been doing book tours all over the world, How to Tame a Fox and Make a Dog. But to formally introduce Professor Alan Dugatkin, he's a professor of biology and a College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Scholar at the University of Louisville, USA. His main areas of research interest are evolution of social behavior and the history of science. He has published 10 books and more than 175 journal articles in various journals, including the Proceedings of National Academy of Science USA, Proceedings of Royal Society of London, and is a contributing author to Scientific American, Slate Magazine, and The New Scientist. He has lectured about his books and research at more than 175 venues around the world, including New Zealand, Australia, Mongolia, Cuba, Russia, Romania, Turkey, the Czech Republic, Croatia, Taiwan, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and now India. The New York Times Book Review called his 2017 book, the one I just mentioned, How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog, published by the University of Chicago Press, sparkling, a story that is part science, part Russian fairy tale, and part spy thriller. So I hope a lot of you would now want to read the book, and I again highly recommend it. But today Lee is not going to talk to us about this book of his. He's going to actually talk about something very related to another fascinating book by him on the Prince of Evolution. Welcome, Lee. Warm welcome to you, and thank you for accepting the invitation. The floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Andy. And I really appreciate you and the whole team at your end setting this talk up. I've really been looking forward to it. I apologize that we had to push the talk back a couple of weeks. But I do love giving Darwin Day talks. I have a friend of mine in Sweden who every time I say something about Darwin Day, he tells me that every day is Darwin Day in Sweden, and that's sort of the way I like to think about things. So I still think of this as a Darwin Day talk. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to come and listen. And I have to say that I hope that one day I will add an in-person visit to you and your group and Raghavendra's group in Bangalore, and hopefully in time that'll happen. Today, I want to give you a sort of talk that amounts to an adventure tale in both science and a little bit of politics. And so for me, this story began about in the late 1980s when I was doing my graduate work on the evolution of cooperation and altruism. And, as a young graduate student, when I started out, even then I had an interest in the history of science. And so I thought the best way to start is to sort of read all the historical material I could. And I quickly came upon the work of the fellow that I'm going to talk about today, Peter Kropotkin, and his ideas on cooperation. And I read everything Kropotkin did, and I was really blown away, both by the scope of what he did and by the fact that almost nobody talks about Kropotkin's work, even though I'm going to make the case today that he's probably the most important evolutionary biologist you've never really heard about in detail before. So what I'm going to do now is just take 10 seconds. I'm going to go over to my desk and I'm going to switch on to my slides. So just give me one moment to do that, and we will begin on the official slide presentation. So I'm going to turn my video off, and let's see here. Just give me one more moment. And if I do this right. So, now, if you could tell me, do you see my slide up on your end? I assume that you do, but I'm not. I assume that that's the case. All right. Let's see. Can we turn? Can somebody just at your end let me know if everything looks
I
okay?
can't see the slides yet, Lee.
You can or you can't?
I cannot.
You cannot. Oh.
No, not yet.
Oh, hold on. So oh, I'm sorry. Yep, I didn't push the right button. That's why I'm always glad. Now, how about now?
Yes, it's coming up.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. We're back now. Okay, great. So the story here actually begins when Peter Kropotkin is very young. So Kropotkin's family descended from a line of minor princes in Russia. And in 1850, in Russia, there was a grand ball in honor of Tsar Nicholas's 25th year in power. And Kropotkin's parents were, Alexander and Elizabeth, were invited, but Peter, who was 8 years old, wasn't. But there were a handful of young boys and girls who were invited to dress up in costumes from all over the world and parade before the Tsar. One of them got sick, and Peter Kropotkin fit the Persian prince outfit that this young boy was supposed to wear. So he actually did go to the ball. And the reason I'm telling you this is that when Kropotkin paraded in front of the Tsar, he apparently made quite the impression on the Tsar, who turned to Kropotkin's parents and said, "This is the sort of boy you must bring me." And what that meant was that the Tsar wanted Kropotkin, when he got older, to be part of something called the Corps of Pages, which was the training ground for the next generation of leaders in Russia. So there's a period between when this happens and when Kropotkin joins the Corps of Pages. And during this time, Kropotkin is taught mostly by private tutors. His parents had the money to do that. And although his parents didn't know this, one of the things that his tutor was teaching him was about these new ideas on the political philosophy of anarchy. His tutor was an underground anarchist who was teaching young Kropotkin about this. And Peter was absolutely fascinated, and very quickly, when he was 12 years old, renounced the title of prince from his name. So time goes by, and in 1857, he enters this Corps of Pages under now Tsar Alexander II. And again, this place, the Corps of Pages, is where the next generation of leaders are taught. And so when Kropotkin goes in here, having been surreptitiously tutored in anarchist philosophy, he was already sort of setting himself up for trouble because of the course of the Tsar and the leaders of Russia were not particularly fond of these anarchist ideas. And already Kropotkin was thinking about them when he went into the core pages at 15. And he's spending his time secretly, partly reading more about anarchy. But more important, he's actually, in the next few years, reading about Charles Darwin's ideas on natural selection. So after The Origin of Species comes out in 1859, about a year after that, Kropotkin is still in the core of pages, and he is corresponding with his brother, Sasha. And one of the things they're talking about is these new scientific ideas in this new area of evolution that Sasha, his older brother, is learning about at university. So they begin an exchange of letters, and Sasha is telling his younger brother about these lectures that a professor at the university is giving on this thing called transformism, which is what today we would call evolution. And they go back and forth about this, and so Kropotkin, at a very young age, is, in addition to immersing himself in anarchist literature, is also immersing himself in the literature of this new area of evolutionary biology. What this translates into is Kropotkin becoming more and more fascinated with Darwin and the ideas that Darwin was putting out to the world. Kropotkin was a brilliant young man, and he quickly rose to the rank of sergeant in the core of pages. And sergeant was the top rank that a young teenager could have in the core of pages. What it meant was he was essentially the personal page to the Tsar. He finished up his time in the core of pages in 1862, and because he was the sergeant, he had first choice of appointments where to go once he graduated. And he had decided that what he wanted to do was use whatever political appointment he got in a way that would send him to Siberia to study Darwin's ideas on natural selection. Technically, he had to have some political appointment, but underneath that, what he wanted to do was use this to study these ideas that he had been reading about in Darwin's works. So, to the amazement of both his peers and his father, Kropotkin requests an appointment to a Cossack infantry in this newly annexed Amur region of Siberia. The Tsar is also quite stunned by this choice and tells Peter, "So you want to go to Siberia? Are you not afraid to go so far?" To which Kropotkin told him, "No, this is where I want to go." And so the Tsar says, "Well, go. One can be useful everywhere." Nobody quite understood what he was doing here. He could have gone anywhere he wanted, and he chooses the frozen tundra of Siberia again, because what he wants to do is basically take his version, a much colder version of the Voyage of the Beagle, to study natural history and these new ideas in evolution in Siberia. So on July 27th, just a little bit after a month or so after graduating, the Kropotkin, who's now 21, begins this incredible 5-year, 50,000-mile trek back and forth through Siberia. And one day I needed a break from what I was doing, and so I actually made up a little Google map of all of the places that Kropotkin visited from when he left St. Petersburg to when he went to Siberia. And each one of these is a separate spot he visited, and some of them he visited many times. So he would kind of go back and forth. So this was an amazing adventure, truly the stuff of movies. Kropotkin would write in his journal of lying full length in the sled, wrapped in fur blankets, fur inside and fur outside, when the temperature is 40 or 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, as it is in Siberia in the winter. I learned this personally, as Anandita mentioned to you. I did this book on domestication of foxes, and that experiment was in Siberia. And so I had the chance to be in Siberia in the winter, and it came close to minus 40, not minus 60, but still, I could get an inkling of the kind of weather that Kropotkin had to deal with. Here he is going around on a sled wrapped in fur blankets. And over he talks about these incredible adventures. So technically, his job for the Tsar was to inspect prisons throughout Siberia. And so he was known, when he would come to a place, he was known as the Tsar's representative doing this. And so people looked at him as a, even though he was just 21, as a person in power. And he would tell these incredible stories of how he would ask people to help him get across frozen lakes in a way that would be safe. And the people he would interact with were so worried that something might happen to Kropotkin if they tried to help him, and therefore they would be looked at in a negative light by the Tsar, that they would make him sign something like this document that they made him sign when he tried to cross the Tom River, which was, "I, the Understein, hereby testify that I was drowned by the will of God and through no fault of the peasants who were trying to help him." The peasants actually made him sign this because they didn't want the Tsar to get upset at them in case something happened to his young representative as he went through Siberia. So when Kropotkin left for Siberia, thinking about Darwin's ideas, what he imagined he would see was the sort of intense, fierce competition that his brother Sasha had told him about in Darwin's works, that he would see this kind of dog-eat-dog world where natural selection played out by fierce competition among individuals. So this was his mindset when he went in. And this was very much the mindset that was being portrayed coming out of England, Darwin's works and Huxley's interpretations of them, as we'll see. But when Kropotkin got to Siberia and started studying the natural history of the animals there, he was shocked. And he wrote, "I failed to find it. That is, this intense competition between individuals, although I was eagerly looking for it. I was looking for that bitter struggle for the means of existence among animals belonging to the same species," Kropotkin writes, "which was considered by most Darwinists as the dominant characteristic of the struggle for life and the main factor of evolution." And look as he could, he was not seeing this very often. Instead, Kropotkin records in his journals and then his later writings that what he was seeing was things like animals giving alarm calls to warn one another of danger. He was seeing herds of ruminants or horses forming a ring in order to resist an attack of wolves, a kind of group anti-predator behavior. Animals sharing food with one another, animals huddling for warmth. He even writes of kittens or lambs playing in these various Siberian villages that he was visiting. These were, in a sense, antithetical to the sort of things he thought he was going to see, this intense dog-eat-dog struggle. Instead, he was seeing these sorts of things. He summarized it later, what it looked like across these 5 years, seeing these sort of things this way. "Wherever I saw life in abundance, as for instance on the lakes, in the colonies of rodents, in the migration of birds, and especially in the migration of fallow deer, which I witnessed, in all these scenes of animal life which passed before my eyes, I saw mutual aid and mutual support carried on to an extent which made me suspect in it a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of each species, and its further evolution. It was this mutual aid and mutual support that was the dominant characteristic of the animals that Kropotkin was seeing. Today, we would call this mutual aid and mutual support various types of cooperation and altruism. But for Kropotkin at the time, the language was mutual aid and mutual support. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this at all, but I just want you to know that Kropotkin was seeing this mutual aid in humans as well as in non-humans. So as I said, he was going from village to village and often inspecting prisons. And everywhere he went, he saw mutual aid in these small Siberian villages. He would write, "The constructive work of the unknown masses," wrote Kropotkin, "which so seldom finds any mention in books. The importance of that constructive work in the growth of forms of society fully appeared before my eyes, learning something which cannot be learned from books." Everywhere he went, he saw people in these villages engaged in some sort of mutual aid, helping each other build a small house, feeding, sharing food, doing all sorts of things that were sort of analogous to what he was seeing in non-humans going on in humans as well. He developed a theory to explain the variance that he was seeing in mutual aid in humans. So, some of these villages, he'd see lots of mutual aid. In other villages, he'd see some, but not as much. And he wanted to understand sort of why it was that some places there was black, some places there was a little. And here is where we see Kropotkin first sort of merging ideas on evolution by natural selection and these anarchist philosophical positions that he had been learning about since he was a teenager. So Kropotkin's theory for the variance in mutual aid seeding humans was that degree of mutual aid was positively correlated with the distance from a state authority. The further the village was from some sort of seat of state authority, the more mutual aid he saw. The closer it was, the more directly it was being governed by some large state authority, the less mutual aid he saw. And this is very much in accord with an anarchist view of the world that holds that people don't need large-scale government, that when you let people interact together in small groups, they will inherently display mutual aid. And this is what he was seeing in humans. And in addition, he was seeing all of this mutual aid in non-humans. No matter where he looked, he would summarize what he saw like this: aggregations of organisms trying to find out the best ways of combining the wants of the individual with those of cooperation for the welfare of the species. And this is really the time when Kropotkin becomes obsessed with this notion of mutual aid. As he's going around through Siberia, he's developing all of these ideas based on what he's seeing, and he's coming up with a very different view of the way that evolution works and what was being portrayed in the literature, or at least what people were saying Darwin was saying. Soon, Kropotkin was writing almost poetically about the kind of mutual aid he was seeing and what it meant. So soon he was writing things like this: practice mutual aid. This is the surest means for giving to each and all the greatest safety, the best guarantee of existence and progress, bodily, intellectually, and morally. After he's developing these ideas, he's really seeing the power of them. This is from a book that we'll talk about in a little bit. And so this quote continues: "This is what Nietzsche teaches us, and that is what all those animals which have attained the highest position in their respective classes have done. That is, they have displayed mutual aid." So Kropotkin goes to Siberia thinking about evolution by natural selection, but initially thinking about it as it being played out by fierce competition between individuals rather than the mutual aid that he saw. But this did not change Kropotkin's notion that natural selection was driving what he was seeing. It's just that instead of competition, it was mutual aid that was the driving force. And so he considered himself and wrote of himself as a true Darwinist. Natural selection drove evolutionary change. But for Kropotkin, it was natural selection that favored these aggregations of organisms trying to find the best ways of combining the wants of the individual with those of cooperation for the welfare of the species. So this, for Kropotkin, he became part of this camp in Russia that considered themselves true Darwinists. Right? The difference between their view and the view that was coming out of England, mostly through the hand of Huxley, who we're going to talk about in a moment, was not whether Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection was correct, but whether or not natural selection was primarily favoring mutual aid, as Kropotkin thought, or this kind of fierce dog-eat-dog competition that he was hearing about. So in 1867, Kropotkin finishes up with this incredible 5-year adventure through Siberia. At that point, he spent some time as a student at St. Petersburg University. There he is beginning to display this kind of polymath knowledge that for me was one of the things that really drew me to Kropotkin's work. At St. Petersburg, he was studying mathematics. He was taking classes in biology. He was translating Herbert Spencer's work. He was a leading member of the Geological Society, and he was immersing himself in anarchist literature at the same time. After that, about 5 years later, he spent some time in Switzerland, in the canton of Jura, where again, he is immersing himself in this political philosophy of anarchism, while at the same time being very active in reading and studying Darwin's ideas on natural selection, and also becoming one of the leading young geologists in the country. But it's his immersion in this anarchist philosophy that's going to get him in trouble, because as you can imagine, and as I mentioned, the Tsar and the political establishment in Russia was very, very worried about this anarchist philosophy. So worried that they were jailing leaders very quickly. And Kropotkin was already known as one of the young leaders of the anarchist movement, and in fact was tracked down eventually by the Tsar's secret police. Right at this time is when his ideas on anarchy and evolution are truly fusing together. Shortly before, he's arrested. Kropotkin is writing that this anarchist philosophy that he's studying, anarchy, was a mere summing up of the next phase of evolution. So the Russian secret police grab this young anarchist / scientist, and they throw him in prison. And not just any prison, but the Peter and Paul prison, which is where they put people who they thought were the most dangerous people. And Kropotkin now is sitting in the Peter and Paul prison for 2 years. So think about the journey this person has already taken. When he was 17 in the Corps of Pages, he was the personal page to the Tsar, a position that no young person could have in Russia, a position that was higher than any young person in Russia could potentially hope for. Then he goes off and studies in Siberia and comes back and immerses himself in both evolution and in anarchist philosophy. And now he's sitting in prison, in the Peter and Paul prison, for 2 years. Eventually, he and some of the other prisoners decided they simply had to do anything they possibly could do to escape, because it was clear that they were not going to be let out anytime in the near future. So they hatched this incredible escape plan. And the idea is that they will be looking out over the walls of the Peter and Paul prison. And when they see a red balloon heading up into the sky, that is a signal from their co-conspirators on the outside that this is the best time to make a break for it, that the guards are set in a position where if you're going to get out, this is the best time for you to do it. And these red balloons were sold every day outside the prison in St. Petersburg. This one day where they were going to do the escape, no red balloons were being sold, and the escape plan is abandoned. But Kropotkin and his co-conspirators are not going to give up. So they plan another jailbreak attempt. And here's a little schematic of what was going on. And all I want you to see is the sort of detail that they went into. There was going to be a co-conspirator walking around on the outside with a microscope talking to the guards to try and distract them. There was another co-conspirator who was sitting there with cherries, spitting them out on the ground, again, to kind of distract the guards. There was a third co-conspirator on the outside that was going around in search of a room and asking the guards all these questions, all meant to distract the guards. Then the co-conspirators on the outside, the plan was that one of them would play a mazurka on their violin. And when Kropotkin and the people on the inside heard that, that was the time that they were going to make their jailbreak. That was the mazurka they heard. They rushed towards the gate. They got past the guards. And this is a sketch that was drawn much later of a chariot that was waiting on the outside for them when they escaped. Kropotkin immediately headed to the docks, where he jumped on to a ship that was sailing over to England, and he settles in England and eventually gets a position as a small science writer at various magazines in England, including the relatively new magazine Nature. And soon after he settles in England, he gets into a fascinating argument with Thomas Henry Huxley. So Huxley publishes a piece called The Struggle for Existence, a Program. Huxley was essentially the voice of Darwin and Darwin's ideas on evolution by natural selection. Huxley enjoyed standing up and talking about these ideas, in part because he knew how much it would disturb many of the leading people in England. Darwin was not the kind of person to do that, but Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, a nickname that he gave to himself, enjoyed it very much. And so he publishes this piece in a magazine called 19th Century. And it's important to understand that this magazine is it's sort of the leading popular intellectual magazine of the day. So this was a place where all the leaders around the country would publish various essays. So the prime minister might write an essay on some political issue. Beatrix Potter, the famous children's author, would publish stories in the 19th century, and leading scientists would also publish articles in this magazine called 19th Century. And here is what Kropotkin, here's what Huxley writes in this essay called The Struggle for Existence. He's writing about essentially Darwinian natural selection. And Huxley writes, from the viewpoint of the moralist, the animal world is on about the same level as the gladiator stage. The creatures are fairly well treated and set to fight, whereby the strongest, the swiftest, and the cunningest live to fight another day. The weakest and the stupidest went to the wall, while the toughest and the shrewdest, those who were best fitted to cope with their circumstances, but not best in any other way, survived. Life was a continuous free fight, and beyond the limited and temporary relations of a family, the Hobbesian war of each against all was the normal state of existence. This is taking a dog-eat-dog world view of the world and pushing it to its extreme. It's the exact opposite view that Peter Kropotkin has of the way that natural selection operates. And Kropotkin is going to let Huxley and the rest of the world know that. To this point, he hasn't published anything major on his ideas about mutual aid. He certainly published a lot on anarchy, but he hasn't published a lot yet on mutual aid. And so what he does, let me step back here. Oh, let me go back here, excuse me. What he does is he uses that same magazine, 19th Century, to write a series of essays on mutual aid in non-humans as well as mutual aid in humans. Over time, he takes all of those essays and he puts them together with some introductory and closing material and publishes his book, Mutual Aid. To put this into context, Kropotkin published Mutual Aid around the year 1900. For the next 50 years, this was an incredibly popular book. In 1950, it was still rated by biologists as one of the most important books around. After that, it sort of dropped off the map, but initially it was viewed as an extraordinarily important book. And again, it's basically the essays that Kropotkin wrote in response to Huxley's Gladiator essay. And so I just want to quickly take you through some of the chapters in this book to show you what Kropotkin is talking about. So first of all, he opens with mutual aid among animals. And this is where he talks about his time in Siberia and all the examples that we discussed earlier on, plus many, many more. Chapter 3 actually, is what Kropotkin calls mutual aid among savages. So I'm using the terminology, very antiquated terminology that he used here. Mutual aid among savages, a term we would not be using now, but Kropotkin used. And so, for example, in this chapter, he writes, if anything is given to a Hottentot, he at once divides it among all present, a habit which, as is known, so much struck Darwin. The harmony which prevails in the village of Polynesian inhabitants of the Pacific Islands. Over and over, he's writing about mutual aid in these kinds of societies. Again, chapter 4, mutual aid among what Kropotkin was calling barbarians, which he meant sort of the tribes around the year 400 plus. And here, Kropotkin writes about common agriculture becoming the rule in barbarian village communities, common agriculture being an example of mutual aid. Kropotkin has an entire chapter on mutual aid in the medieval city, which he views in many ways as one of the pinnacles of historical pinnacles of mutual aid. So in the medieval city, Kropotkin writes about these free cities that are a natural growth in the full sense of the word. Free cities have been called into existence on the coast of the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Baltic, the Atlantic Ocean, down to the fjords of Scandinavia, and so on. Everywhere the same kind of revolt took place with the same features, passing through the same phases, leading to the same results. And those results, co-jurations, fraternities, friendships, guilds, all examples of people coming together and interacting cooperatively, expressing mutual aid. Kropotkin writes about mutual aid in much more modern terms, in much more modern societies. In many ways, for Kropotkin, let me go back here. For Kropotkin, mutual aid among ourselves, meaning in the contemporary times in the last few hundred years for Kropotkin. A great example of that for Kropotkin was the French Revolution before it went bad. And of course, he also discussed mutual aid among communities in the year 1900 when the book came out. But for Kropotkin, the French Revolution was a wonderful example of mutual aid, again, before it went bad. Around this time, Kropotkin is becoming an international celebrity for his ideas, both his scientific ideas and his ideas as an anarchist. And in 1897, he comes to the United States to basically do a speaking tour. And he is followed everywhere he goes. The New York Times is writing about him constantly. Now, to give you a sense, when Kropotkin came to the United States in 1897, he had already published full-length books, or the equivalent, on mutual aid. So at this point, the mutual aid example is all the essays he had written in 19th century that he's going to paste together into his book. He had written a book on the geography of Asia. He had written a book on anarchy as a political philosophy. He had written a book on anarchy and science. He had written a multi-hundred-page book on the French Revolution. He had written a book on socialism and communism. He had written a book on the penal systems in Asia and Europe. This was a polymath, and everyone wanted to hear what this guy had to say. He even wrote a book on the coming industrial revolution in Asia and the state of Russian literature at the time. So when Kropotkin first gets to the US, he attends the AAAS meeting, the meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the association that produces the journal Science. So Kropotkin goes to the 1897 meeting of the AAAS. Then he goes to Washington, D.C., and he lectures about his ideas on mutual aid at the National Geographic Society. From there, he goes to New York City. He lectures to a crowd of 2,000 people on socialism and modern development. Then he goes to the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. He lectures again to a group of 2,000 about everything from sociology to mutual aid and history. Goes to Boston, gives a series of lectures on mutual aid in humans, does another series of lectures at Harvard on everything you can imagine, the socialist movement in Europe. He gives a talk to the Women's Industrial Club of Cambridge. He gives a pair of talks at a local church on Christianity and morality. And those two things were not linked in Kropotkin's head. He goes back to New York City, gives talks on the philosophical and scientific basis of anarchism, the struggle for freedom in Russia, and the great social problems of our century, again, constantly being followed by the New York Times. Goes back to England, returns to the United States in 1901 after his book Mutual Aid is published, gives a whole series of lectures on mutual aid, many of them on mutual aid, Darwin, and cooperation in animals. Goes back to England. He's going to come to the United States again to give yet another tour, lecture tour, but the United States President William McKinley was assassinated in late 1901. And he was assassinated by an anarchist. And the United States government essentially banned anarchists from coming into the country. And so Kropotkin never took that third tour of the United States. So he's back in England. And what I want to focus on just for the end of the talk now, for the last 10 minutes or so, is two problems Kropotkin was struggling with when he returned to England. And these are problems associated with his theory of mutual aid, particularly as they applied to non-humans. So this idea that natural selection is favoring mutual aid is spread across virtually all of Kropotkin's writings, and it's what he is becoming quite famous for. But he had a couple of issues that he struggled with, that he couldn't quite fit into his theory of mutual aid, at least initially. And I want to tell you about those, and I want to tell you how Kropotkin tried to solve them. So the two problems were this. One was a proximate problem. That is, for Kropotkin, he wanted to know in real time what caused animals, and also humans, but we're going to focus primarily on animals here, to display mutual aid. Not the evolutionary ultimate question, which was, did natural selection favor mutual aid? And Kropotkin was absolutely convinced that it did, and I think many of us would agree with that. But this was a proximate problem, which was in real time, what triggered an animal, let's focus on animals here, to display mutual aid. He also did have an evolutionary problem, a problem with respect to ultimate causation. And that problem was that it appeared to Kropotkin that mutual aid evolved way faster than it should under sort of standard Darwinian explanations for the speed of natural selection. All right, so first let's look at this initial problem. In real time, what causes animals and humans to display mutual aid? Again, we'll focus on animals. So here, Kropotkin turns to the work of a very unexpected source, and that is Adam Smith, the founder of modern capitalism, an economic philosophy that Kropotkin had no use for whatsoever. But it turns out that many years before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, his famous capitalist tract, he wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And this was published in 1749. And Kropotkin was fascinated by this book of Adam Smith's, not The Wealth of Nations. And the wealth and the theory of moral sentiments ended up providing Kropotkin what he needed to understand the proximate problem. What caused animals to display mutual aid in real time? So here's how Kropotkin solved this problem using Adam Smith's book. So Kropotkin writes, in a fine work, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, Adam Smith has laid his finger on the true origin of moral sentiment. He does not seek it in mystical religious feelings. He finds it simply in the feeling of sympathy. Today, we would use the word empathy here rather than sympathy, but Kropotkin calls it sympathy. And so here's how Kropotkin describes this. You see a man beat a child. You know that the beaten child suffers. Your imagination causes you yourself to suffer the pain inflicted upon the child, or perhaps its tears, its little suffering face tell you. And if you are not a coward, you rush at the brute who is beating it and rescue it from him. This example by itself explains almost all of the moral sentiments. This is, so stepping out for a second, this here is what we would refer to as empathy today, the ability to take the perspective of the individual, who in this case is suffering, to feel what they're feeling and then to act to stop that suffering. What Kropotkin is calling sympathy, what we would call empathy. Now, this is what Adam Smith is writing about in the theory of moral sentiments. Kropotkin writes, Adam Smith's only mistake was not to have understood that the same feeling of sympathy in its habitual state exists among animals as well as among men. Kropotkin, from his observations and his readings, had come to believe that animals also possess this empathetic ability. And that empathetic ability, the ability to put yourself into the position of another and to feel what they're feeling and then to act on that gave him the solution to the proximate problem. Why did animals engage in mutual aid? Because they could put themselves into the position of other animals who needed things, right? Who were in some position where they needed assistance. You feel what they're feeling. And because that feeling is uncomfortable, you don't like needing things to be in need of food or protection. In order to mitigate that, you engage in mutual aid. Your empathetic feelings lead you to act cooperatively. So Kropotkin now had the second problem, which was, could Darwinian processes operate quickly enough to account for the mutual aid he was seeing in animals? It seemed to him that mutual aid was evolving really quickly. So he would see that as soon as a kind of problem developed, relatively quickly, a mutual aid solution evolved in the animal populations he was looking at. There might not have been a problem initially, and then some sort of problem that required mutual aid appeared, and relatively quickly, the animals were displaying mutual aid. And Kropotkin saw this as happening too fast for kind of standard Darwinian processes. The answer here for Kropotkin lay in Lamarckian inheritance, also known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, I'm sure many of you know this, but perhaps some of you are not all that familiar with Lamarckian inheritance. So just to refresh you, basic idea, the classic example is giraffe necks here. So imagine we have giraffes with short necks, and they stretch their necks to reach food. The stretching increases their own neck length through use. You're basically stretching your necks and you're stretching the muscles, and through that use, your necks get longer. What makes Lamarckian inheritance what it is the notion that by your use, in this case, of the muscles associated with stretching the neck, your offspring will be born with those longer necks that are the result of what you did by stretching your neck as far as you could in the prior generation. Today, we would say the action of stretching the necks alters the genetics of the stretcher so that longer necks become genetically encoded and inherited across generations, right? So we know, in fact, today that this is wrong, that Lamarckian inheritance is at best exceptionally rare. But in Kropotkin's time, this was not really well understood. It was an idea worth considering. And it was important because it can result in rapid evolutionary change. If some giraffes in generation X stretch their necks, then in generation X plus 1, offspring of those individuals can have slightly longer necks and perhaps even more than slightly longer necks, depending on what their parents were capable of doing the generation before. It produces longer necks really quickly compared to standard Darwinian processes. So Kropotkin applies this idea to mutual aid. If individuals in generation X display a bit more mutual aid, or perhaps a lot more mutual aid, then in the very next generation, offspring of those individuals will have genes associated with displaying more mutual aid. Mutual aid, then, can spread very quickly with this Lamarckian inheritance, solving for Kropotkin his second problem. So now he has an answer both to the proximate problem and the ultimate problem. So let me just finish up now with just a minute thinking about Kropotkin's legacy for today. So we look back and sure, he was wrong about certain things, particularly about Lamarckian inheritance. But Darwin also thought Lamarckian inheritance might be real. And at the time Kropotkin was writing this, it was a reasonable idea. Sure, we know it's wrong today, but that's today. More importantly, I think his legacy can be seen in the hundreds of labs around the world that in one way or another are studying the evolution of cooperation. Kropotkin was the first person to develop a full-blown theory of how natural selection could favor cooperation and altruism, what he was calling mutual aid. Before that, Darwin wrote a little bit about it, no question about it. But Kropotkin was the first person to develop a full-blown theory. What's more, Kropotkin was really the first person to argue that animals were capable of empathy. Again, if you look in the literature, others had dabbled with this idea, but Kropotkin was the first person to give it really serious consideration. And again, if we look today, we see over the last couple of decades that animal behaviorists and behavioral ecologists have begun looking at empathy in non-humans. In fact, one of my PhD students, Carolyn Driscoll, her dissertation is looking at empathy in a rat system today. Again, we can look back, and if we think in terms of the history of science, we see again that Kropotkin was the founder, essentially, of this empathetic view of mutual aid. So when we look around and we see all of the work that's being done in cooperation and altruism and empathy, we need to stop and think that much of it began with the ideas of this man, Peter Kropotkin. So what I am going to do now, if you will just again give me 1 minute, is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I am going to get into a position where I can answer as many questions as you have. I appreciate the fact that many of you stuck with me, even though this was a relatively long talk, but I hope it was worth it. So let me see. I'm stopping my sharing now, and I will put on my video, and hopefully you can now hear and see me. Yes?
Not yet. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Now you can see now? Yes, we're
Yes.
good or no? Okay, great, great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I am more than happy to answer as many questions as you have.
Thank you. It was fantastic. For people like us who study cooperation, hearing about Kropotkin's work is always very, very inspiring. So we have a couple of questions already on YouTube. The first is from my colleague, Professor Sumana Annagiri, who actually works on ants. So she's asking, did Kropotkin say anything specific regarding mutual aid in social insects?
Yeah, so he did. He was absolutely fascinated with mutual aid in ants in particular. And so while he wasn't seeing a lot of that in Siberia, he was, in fact, looking for it when he was living in England, and he would often write. In fact, I almost made a new slide and put this in there. He has this wonderful quote in one of his articles or books where he talks about how the ants haven't read Kant and the New Testament and the Old Testament, and yet they're capable of displaying all of these acts of mutual aid. He was completely fascinated by the social insect in terms of their mutual aid. For reasons that, of course, I think we all understand is that they're in many ways they display a circle of mutual aid in non-humans. And so while it wasn't the focus of what he did, he was aware and was always looking whenever he could at mutual aid in social insects. And I can surely find the actual references for the question. And anybody who writes, if you can't figure out or don't want to ask a question here, you can always email me. And it's just really curious about you, and I can send you. I can answer your question, send you some references, anything you want.
Thank you. That's fascinating, actually. Okay, so the next question here is, so was this the beginning of the theory of epigenetics?
If you are using epigenetics and Lamarckian inheritance as synonyms, then you could certainly make the case that Kropotkin was relying on a kind of epigenetic explanation for the speed at which mutual aid evolved. But I don't think it would be fair to say that it was the start of epigenetics, because certainly Lamarckian inheritance had been around since the I'm trying to think. I think Lamarck's books where he really gets into this are right at around 1800 or so. So Lamarck's ideas have been around, and we tend today to think of kind of talk about Lamarckian inheritance versus Darwinian views of the way that natural selection operates. But in Darwin's time, that distinction was much weaker. That is, Darwin lays out his theory, but he doesn't reject Lamarckian inheritance in The Origin of Species at all. So the ideas had been around, and they were still certainly very respectable in Kropotkin's time. So he does turn to what we would say today are epigenetic answers, but he's not the first to do that by any means.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't see any more questions coming up right now. So I will ask you a question of my own. Even when I read the book and right now when I was hearing your talk, something that always struck me was, the way you present this story that, Kropotkin reading on anarchism, and Kropotkin reading up Darwin, and then how he goes to Siberia, looks at real life examples, and he gradually rejects this idea of the dog-eat-dog world. So I often wondered, of course we will never know, but there's no harm in wondering, because often we tell there's this notion that scientists should not indulge in politics, and you should do your science and keep political ideas away. So when I see Kropotkin, and I often wonder that if he was not indulging in anarchist ideas, would he even come up with the idea of mutual aid? So how much was his reading of anarchism and his influence from his tutor influencing his science in the later age?
Sure, it's a great question, and I agree with you that you know, we're always teaching our students that they should be coming at this at their work objectively, and not letting sort of any kind of these biases, political or whatever they might be, influence their work. At the time Kropotkin was doing this, that distinction, you know, was not real yet, and so you're right. We can never know the answer to that question, but I can tell you from reading a tremendous amount of Kropotkin's work that I think a reasonable answer would be it would have been much less likely for him to have taken the route he did in terms of the science of mutual aid if he had not been immersed in the anarchist literature. Because, I mean, the anarchist literature, when he went to Siberia, he was already thinking that what spurs what he would eventually call mutual aid, because another person had used that term, Kropotkin grabbed onto it, what he would call mutual aid emerges not from above, but sort of from below. That when you have small groups of organisms, particularly in harsh environments where there isn't a lot of food or there is a lot of danger, that they will inherently act together in this kind of cooperative fashion. So I mean, that's a very simplistic view of what anarchy is. There's a lot more to it, but it's basically the notion that you don't need large governments from above forcing people to act in pro-social ways, that they will do this if they live in small groups, and they need to do it. And so Kropotkin is going in with that mindset, and it's hard to imagine that doesn't affect what he's seeing when he's looking at non-humans. So I think absolutely it affected his view, and I think, and he'd be the first to say it. I mean, you know, he basically later on, he's not making these distinctions between anarchy and mutual aid that we might be making today. I should say on the other side, right, I mean, the same sort of thing was going on among Huxley and his camp. I mean, these were people who were writing about science in Victorian England, and Victorian England was really this sort of dog-eat-dog society, right? It was very, very based on the notion of competition, not just economic competition, but competition at every level. And when Huxley was writing about, when Huxley wrote the Gladiator essay, he himself had also been on this incredible voyage, right? It wasn't just Darwin who went on the Beagle and Kropotkin who went to Siberia. Huxley was the ship's naturalist on a ship that I think was called the Rattlesnake. And he went down to the tropics in South America and spent a lot of time there. And when he was there, he was in fact seeing much more sort of direct competition than than Kropotkin was seeing in Siberia. I mean, again, this is sort of a simple view, but in many ways, Siberia is this very sparsely populated area where resources are few and far between, and some of the tropical rainforests where Huxley were, you know, sort of beaming with life, right, with lots of resources, where you might expect there to be lots of competition because there's lots of resources to be had if you can win those competitions. And so Huxley is coming into this with his own baggage, both politically and philosophically. So they both were. You know, we just have to recognize that that's the way these early arguments developed.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting perspective. I have another question for you from one of the members of the audience. So she's asking, would you go so far as to say that Kropotkin's studies in anarchism broadened his thinking and set him apart from other scientific people in the Tsar-led Russia, the scientific community in the Tsar-led Russia?
So there was really this school of mutual aid that developed, that Kropotkin very quickly was the leader of. Would I say that it set him apart from other scientists in Russia at the time? You know, I'm going to be a little bit careful answering that question because, you know, what I really know are the scientists in Russia who are doing, you know, evolution and behavior. And so I don't know whether scientists in other disciplines would have been involved in the anarchist movement. My guess is the answer is yes, but I just don't know that well enough. I can say within that circle of evolutionary biologists and behaviorists, I think Kropotkin was clearly the most political of them, with his being in many ways one of the leading anarchists in the world. I will also say that, you know, that wasn't the only thing that set him apart. Again, like one of the reasons I kind of listed all of those books or book equivalents that Kropotkin had written already when he came to the United States in 1897 was to give you a sense that this was just one of these people who was a polymath, and he just could not be intellectually satiated. I mean, he was interested in everything, and it wasn't just that he was interested in this and that or this. For him, he always was trying to look for the connections between things. And so, you know, when he's writing about mutual aid, you know, we already can see the connection between that and his work on anarchy, right? But he also wrote an entire book on the French Revolution. That was driven by his interest in anarchy and mutual aid. He wrote about prisons, and that again was driven by his views of anarchy and mutual aid. So he was not only a polymath, but he was very synthetic in his ways of operating, in ways that, you know, for me, he is one of a very few people in my intellectual pantheon of heroes.
Thank you. In today's words, he would be a perfect interdisciplinary researcher, breaking all the silos.
That's right. He was doing that way before people were using that terminology. Absolutely.
Okay, the last question here. Kropotkin explained mutual aid with sympathy or empathy. And the student goes on to ask, the feeling of sympathy is generated in the brain. So does this mean that we connect evolution to the brain?
Oh, surely, yes. The answer is surely yes. Not just for that reason, but that's one reason. And so, you know, people, for example, who are studying empathy and other pro-social behaviors, behavioral biologists are doing this. They're looking at it at many different levels. And so there's the question of sort of what are the animals doing? What's the actual behavior? There's the question of what's the evolutionary forces that are operating. And then the brain is sort of that black box through which all of this is sort of moving. I mean, basically for the animals to behave the way they are, their brain has to be processing information in a particular way. And the very way that the brain is processing information is the result of natural selection. And so there is a tremendous amount of research on brain research that's relevant to the study of evolution and behavior. And empathy is one example. Now, I don't, you know, I wish I had Carolyn on, my student on here as well. I don't know specifically with respect to empathy, whether people have actually gotten a good handle on what's going on in any animal brain with respect to empathy yet. Certainly in human brains, we do, because we can do MRIs while we give people behavioral tests. And we do this in some, we've been able to do it with some animals. We do it with dogs, putting them into MRIs if we really do it, if we're very careful. But I don't know that anyone's actually done it specifically for empathy yet. But eventually they will.
I think recently there was a study on dogs when they were trying to look at not really empathy, but how the brains are responding to humans. So kind of dog-human interactions, and they were doing fMRIs of the dog brains. I don't specifically remember which group, but I definitely remember seeing something like this.
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. It was in the last, I would say in the last year or so, and I think people have long wanted to do that. And I don't remember how they did it, but like the trick was that you had to figure out a way that you could get dogs to be sort of calm enough in an fMRI kind of claustrophobic environment, not to just freak out so much that you can't get any kind of good read. And somehow they figured that out cleverly, but I don't remember how.
Okay, so I think we've been keeping you standing for a long time answering questions. I will ask you a last question because I have the advantage of moderating this session. And this is a question I had about your book, rather about the title of the book. Because Kropotkin was a person who was an anarchist who gave up the title of prince early in his life. And then you titled the book, The Prince of Evolution. So why?
I guess I would say, a book title is a little bit different, right? I mean, so I wanted something that sort of captured lots and lots of aspects of Peter Kropotkin. And I thought The Prince of Evolution was a good title in the sense that, yes, he did renounce the prince label in terms of kind of political side of it. I was trying to make the point, trying to get the idea kind of maybe in a too cute a way, that we could sort of think of him as early royalty with respect to evolutionary ideas. That along with Darwin and Huxley and a few others, they were the early royalty with respect to evolutionary ideas. But certainly Kropotkin would not want to be called prince in any context. He gave that up when he was 12 years old. I was just trying to sort of capture various aspects of what the book would cover.
Thank you. That was nice. Sally, let me thank you once again for being here with us and for the fantastic and engaging talk. It was a great pleasure having you, and we definitely want to have you in person visiting us sometime in the future, hopefully near future.
That would be wonderful.
For listening and on YouTube, so this is going to be available on Isaac Kolkata's YouTube channel. So please feel free to share the link with your friends so that more people can listen to the talk later.
Very good. Well, thank you again for hosting this, and I enjoyed it very much, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes, thank you. Goodbye.
All right, then. Goodbye then. Bye-bye.